Throughout this pandemic, I've discussed how, as a Canadian, I do think Canada has done a lot for its citizens, at least compared to what Trump has done for Americans. But also, as a Canadian, when I do a video specifically about Canada, I do have criticisms. And one of those criticisms is how Canada has treated students during this pandemic. So before I get to an interview that I recently shot, let me set it up here. So you have here NDP MP Heather McPherson discussing a petition that is fighting for students.
And let's not forget the students that attend these devastated institutions. Students and recent graduates need to get the support now. Actually, they needed to get the support in April. The group Don't Forget Students and the Canadian Federation of Students have been asking since April for the federal government to not forget Canada's millions of students and recent graduates left behind during this crisis. This group notes that the Canadian youth unemployment rate reached an all-time high of 29.4% in May. August is a few days away. Students can't afford to wait for more bungled programs that pay less than minimum wage. Let's find a way to ensure that students on the CESB get $2,000 a month, the bare minimum given to every other struggling person in Canada.
So credit to Heather McPherson here and the NDP for fighting for students during this pandemic. And Greg Sibley of the group Don't Forget Students tweeted out in response to this saying, "I'd like to thank the NDP's Heather McPherson for not only being the first MP to sign and share our petition, but also for mentioning Don't Forget Students during her remarks in the House today. Heather is right. Students and recent grads need a $2,000 per month CESB." So I recently talked to Greg Sibley about Canada's response or lack of response and help for students in Canada. I'm joined now by Greg Sibley. He is a lead organizer and a founding member of Don't Forget Students. Greg, thanks for joining me.
Well, thank you very much for having me on, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to have you on to get your thoughts on everything going on. So you've been fighting for students during this pandemic. The Liberal government right now, they have, in terms of students, the Canadian or the Canada Emergency Student Benefit of $12.50 a month, and the Canada Student Service Grant, which was supposed to be given to the We Charity. We'll get more into that in a bit. But discuss your fight so far and the, I guess, your original petition that you had to fight for students during this pandemic.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of good to start from the top. This has been a bit of an odyssey for us. It's now been months and months and months of constant pushing the Liberal government. And of course, that started when the pandemic started. In terms of my background, I'm a recent graduate. I graduated with a master's in November from a school in the UK, came back over to Canada in September to work for the NDP during the federal election. And of course, that didn't quite go our way in downtown Toronto, so my employment prospects didn't quite pan out in the fall like I had hoped. But the long and the short of it is I made a little bit less than the CERB cutoff. CERB, for your American listeners, is Canada's flagship kind of pseudo basic income response to the pandemic, which pays $2,000 a month. But because we have a very neoliberal government up here, it is means tested in a very sharp way. So you are completely ineligible for it if you made less than $5,000 last year. And because I was in school for most of the time, that is a position I myself fell into. And it's also a position that a ton of students fell into for very understandable reasons. And we were really hoping in March and in April, back when CERB was first introduced, high hopes, we had high hopes from across the country, and I'm talking hundreds of thousands, millions of students across the country were really hoping that they would end up qualifying for CERB because the pandemic, it hit young people like a storm. We've been one of the most affected demographics, but what happened at the end of March and the beginning of April is that the Liberals announced that no, it would not apply to students. And it wasn't even as generous now as it's then. So we were left out, and hundreds of thousands and millions of students were in a position where their government wasn't backing them up. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of concern. So the group I became a founding member of founded kind of organically. Like we we really just kind of all were doing our separate, letter writing, petition writing, online social media efforts. And we kind of all ended up getting together in a single Facebook thread. This is about 20 people or so from, across the country, different schools, a mixture of everything from current undergrad students to graduating law students to recent master's graduates like myself. So a really diverse cross-section of the student population in the country. So we all ended up getting together, we put our heads together, and we decided to really pool our resources into creating a single grassroots organization. And we came up with the name Don't Forget Students because, for obvious reasons, we felt that students were getting forgotten. Mm-hmm. So we had a hashtag that we got up, and we built a petition around it, which basically asked for CERB. We basically asked for income assistance, immediate income assistance for all recent graduates and students, regardless of all of these income requirements that the Liberals had put on the original CERB. And lo and behold, it got a lot of traction very quickly. Within our first day, we actually had 4 NDP MPs signed on. Matthew Green out in Hamilton Center was the first. We also had Charlie Angus, Peter Julian, Don Davies sign up. And I think we were over 1,000 signatures within our first day. And, keep in mind, this is a group that was founded really on the fly by people that had never met, and we had zero resources. So we got a lot of traction. It kind of started to build from there. We ended up forming a kind of alliance or partnership with CFS, the Canadian Federation of Students, which is the largest student union in the country. And it kind of just took off from there, really. So we ended up getting over 46,000 signatures on our original petition by about 3 weeks in or so. And we decisively pushed the Liberal government to implement the student package that is now at the center of a national ethics investigation, which is, I have to admit, a slightly surreal feeling as someone who was very involved in pushing for that.
Yeah, so let's get to, there are, the unfortunate thing that there are so many details to that scandal that it's going to be impossible to go over all of it. One of the main focuses right now from the media really appears to be on the conflict of interest, which it is definitely an issue. But there's also issues in terms of how it was going to be administered and the amount of money that students were going to be receiving. So there's a recent Press Progress story. Their headline is, "We Charity says Trudeau government told them to pay students less than the minimum wage." Now, this is the exact quote from We to CBC, where they told CBC the government of Canada determined the compensation per hour of service for the CSSG, and We Charity was contracted to administer CSSG according to that decision. So they're saying here that the Trudeau government basically forced their hand, if they were to be the ones to administer this, to pay students less than the minimum wage. What are your thoughts on the approach here that the Liberals have had to students?
Well, I'm pretty angry. I'll be blunt with you. I think that issue, the minimum wage, how this program really blurs the lines between paid labor and volunteer labor, even if it was over minimum wage, even if that glaring issue you mentioned wasn't there, I think it would still be very problematic in a lot of ways, because this is a program that no one is really sure whether this is paid labor or whether this is volunteer labor. And of course, because it actually does pay less than minimum wage. And one thing that a lot of people, I think, don't recognize is the way the CSSG was going to be implemented is it was in these kind of tiered brackets. So I believe if you had to work I can't remember the exact figure, but it was a set number of hours to get $1,000 in grants. And then it was another set number of hours to get $2,000 in grants. So say you're a student, and because they rolled this thing out so late in the game, even if things had gone smoothly, this would have really only come out halfway through the summer. Mm-hmm. So that's another issue that was there. I was wondering what on earth was happening with this thing? Did they forget about it? Were they planning on it? When was this even coming out? Mm-hmm. And it came out 3 weeks ago, of course, and then the scandal broke. But to get back to what I was saying, So say you miss one of those brackets by like 2 hours or so. You're actually making like not just less than minimum wage then, but way less. Like maybe like $4, $5 an hour. Like,
Wow.
imagine if
Yeah.
imagine if you missed that bracket, and there's nothing in the program as it was laid out that that really took into account that number of hours. Like if you didn't make that bracket, you are making way less than minimum wage. That's something that I don't think has actually gotten enough attention.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I didn't know that, and that's incredible. That their approach to students is almost the assumption that you don't even need the money, and it's like they are almost they're taking students for granted, and
Yeah.
thinking that for whatever reason, like this goes back to. I mean, of course, it's my speculation, but it goes back to how I think liberals view students in general as sort of from their own experience. So Justin Trudeau, for example, grew up very privileged. Bill Morneau. If you come from these worlds where you are incredibly privileged individuals and you grew up that way and you've always had access to money, always been able to have connections and get work, then you're going to have a different view of how most students live their lives. Do you think that has anything to do with the liberal approach, or is this also, I mean, of course, also really just their approach to labor in general, where it's always going to be, pro corporate, pro for profit interests, pro the wealthy, and sort of, the average Canadian gets left behind.
Well, my immediate thought there is, that why not both GIF? That's kind of what
Yes.
I'm thinking there.
Hmm.
No, I think that has everything to do, especially this assumption, which I think comes from the personal experiences, quite frankly, of people that actually run a show in the Liberal Party of Canada. And I'm not just talking about the private school old boys like Trudeau, the more middle class folks in cabinets who aren't from maybe those ultra privileged backgrounds like the finance minister and the prime minister are. We really felt when we were pushing them that they had this perception of students that was very much rooted in a kind of 1950s, sitcom or something. It's
Yeah.
the white picket fence, it's the suburban parents, and it's the students need a little bit of spending money or whatever, and maybe a volunteer opportunity. And they completely failed to grasp the actual realities of what Canada's, or what contemporary Canada's student population actually faces. I mean, we had organizers in our group who were single mothers, like
Hmm.
working class single mothers. There are a ton of mature students as well,
Hmm.
graduate students, law students. So I should issue a bit of a disclaimer here. I myself am a card carrying New Democrat. A few of us are in the group, but we also have many liberal organizers in our group. So I should issue a bit of a clarification that when I'm spitting a bit of fire against the Liberal Party of Canada here, I am doing so in more of a personal capacity than speaking for the group. That being said, we have had a number. I think the very presence of young liberals, like highly involved young liberals, from places like the University of Toronto and that kind of thing, in our group, really speaks to how this government is mishandling the student file. Like there's
Hmm.
significant discontent about this, even from partisan young liberals themselves. And I really give the young liberals in our group credit. They've been really indispensable in our efforts. And they've also had the courage to speak out against their own party on the record in some cases, which I know as someone who's pretty partisan myself and is pretty involved in the NDP, that takes a lot of guts. So I really commend them for that. So yeah, I think there's a bit of that going on. I think there's more than a bit of that going on, quite frankly. And I also think there's a bit of a generational division here. I think the people that are really making the policy in the Liberal Party of Canada don't really get what the realities are for millennials or more for Gen Z, which is really more of what we're talking about when we're talking about current students and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
And yeah, the last thing I'll say about that is one of the things in the CESB, which is a $1,250 per month kind of pseudo CERB. I call it kids table CERB. They gave us the
Yeah.
little, they gave like it's almost CERB.
It's like,
I
oh, you
can't
get
believe
some
it's
too.
not
Don't
CERB.
worry, you get some money too. Like a little
Yeah,
pat
yeah,
on the head, like
exactly.
just yeah.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. But unlike, proper CERB, it actually has some really stringent work requirements in it
Mm.
that were put in by the Liberals, largely because of pressure from the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois. But I watched the entire parliamentary proceedings, including the Senate proceedings, which was honestly like almost physically painful watching these Tory dinosaur senators
Hmm.
go on bizarre tangents about how students were just going to pocket government checks and lie by the pool all summer. They were demanding spot checks as well. So, like, they wanted to get the CRA auditing students to literally make sure they were looking for a job every day. This is in the middle of a global pandemic. Like, it makes zero sense.
That's incredible.
And the Liberal cabinet minister responsible for this whole program, including CERB, Carla Qualtrough, she was there for the whole time, and she was just agreeing with the Conservatives. I was honestly almost speechless watching this. Like she was, you know, yes, Senator, reactionary. That is a great idea to do spot checks and see whether students have been knocking on doors during a global
Yeah.
pandemic. So
To me, it seems
it was
a lot like projection because it's almost like they imagine themselves doing that. They imagine themselves just pocketing the money. They imagine themselves essentially trying to take, I guess, the government for granted when really 1250 is not even much of anything. But it's almost like they just assume that everybody has the same upbringing, the same privilege that they do, and they're unable to realize that people need real help, and there's a pandemic going on, and people need a job, or people not even a job, people need financial assistance to be able to survive during this pandemic, and it really is they're just disconnected from reality. And this goes to
one.
your, I guess, your new petition. So you have a new petition out now that is trying to push the government to support students.
Yeah, exactly. So we decided to come together again with our partners at CFS. This time, our original petition was an effort more on our part that we later made some alliances with student groups to promote around shared goals. But this petition is a co-petition between Don't Forget Students and the Canadian Federation of Students. So this is very much a joint effort formally from the get-go. But we decided to come together now that students are bizarrely front and center in the national media again, and this kind of footnote in the original package. I mean, the CESB was really the main event, I would say. The CSSG was a bit of an afterthought, frankly. So
Mm-hmm.
it wasn't really the main focus. But of course, now with this entire We scandal, it has become the single biggest story in Canadian politics for at least the last 2 weeks now. And it shows no signs of slowing down. In fact, it's precisely the opposite. With every new day, there are more serious revelations about this scandal. So we came together in order to write a new petition, trying to use this moment to make sure that students weren't forgotten again. Because I really do, I've got to level with you, David. Like, it's been great seeing all this attention around the We deal and the whole below minimum wage thing and everything in the press. Like it's been great seeing that picked up, and there's been some really great journalists who are looking into this. The NDP's been good too, but what I don't really see, and I think in part this is kind of just because the scandal is taking up so much oxygen and it's just so interesting, but I just don't see that kind of focus on what students are actually going through right now, because the original package had many flaws. It might shock some of your listeners, especially some of your American listeners, to know that personally, I would actually be faring better under Donald Trump than I am under Justin Trudeau.
Yeah, and that's because you wouldn't be getting anything from, or you wouldn't be getting any money from Trudeau, whereas in the U.S. you would be getting, I guess, that one check is what you're saying there.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm a recent graduate, right? Like I graduated in November, but that's 1 month too early for basically the entire student bailout that they've given. So I'm ineligible for the CESB. I wouldn't have been able to apply for the CSSG as well. And I've been trying to fix this. I've been lobbying politicians, mostly liberal cabinet ministers, for months, but haven't gotten too far on this. So in Canada, someone in my position is getting zero, whereas someone across the border in Buffalo in an identical position, literally under, Donald Trump's America, this is, a Mitch McConnell, Senate package, or at least one that went through his Senate, would be doing $1,200 better off than me. And what really, really bothered me is that they actually introduced a bill, or they attempted to introduce a bill. This is the Liberals with conservative support, that was going to criminalize people that, so-called fraudulently applied for CERB, these benefits, like the CESB, with fines and jail. So I'm fortunate enough that I've been able to do some freelance work and my parents are supportive, but an awful lot of people in my position have had to apply, even though they know they don't qualify, just to survive during the pandemic. And the Liberals honestly were looking at that, and they wanted fines and jail, which I'm pretty outraged by. But that is a bit of an aside, I guess, but it's an important one. And I think it illustrates a kind of point that our petition is making about the inadequacies of the original student bailout. It was a very significant measure. It was $10 billion of spending. Truthfully, it was more than we were expecting to get, but it had serious issues. For one, the CESB for most students, unless you're disabled or if you have a dependent, so if you have children of your own, you only get $1,250, which is not enough to even pay the bills in most places where students actually live in Canada. So that's problematic right there. And then there's also, of course, the necessity to save up to pay already sky-high tuition costs to even resume your studies in September. So that's a big problem right there. And let me just say, the CESB should always have paid $2,000. It should always have covered recent graduates like me and international students. International students, which make up a quarter of students in Canada, they have been completely forgotten. So one of our big demands for this Don't Forget Students petition, the second one we're doing, is demanding that the CESB is raised to $2,000 per month, that it's broadened to extend to fall 2019 graduates like myself and international students. And we're also demanding that it's extended. So CERB ended up getting extended by 3 payment periods because of the economic damage that COVID-19 has really done to whole swaths of the country's economy. Many people simply don't have jobs to go back to. And we think that the same thing needs to happen with the CESB if students are going to be able to resume their studies in the fall. Because we're approaching a crisis. We're sleepwalking into a crisis of post-secondary education in this country. And it just wasn't getting coverage. It's still not really getting coverage. But what we're hoping is that the WE scandal provides enough of a political opening for us to win some major victories.
Well, I wish you all the luck in that. And I hope people check out the petition. I'll link to it below the video in the description box so people can click on there and read about what you guys are fighting for, because it's truly, it's crazy just the complete lack of help that students have received from this Liberal government. And you're right, it has largely been forgotten and not really discussed in the way that it should be discussed. So I'm glad to have you on. Thank you for your fight, and keep going. And where can people find you online?
Oh, that's a very good question. Well, thank you very much for all of the kind words. I really appreciate you letting me come onto your channel, and tell everybody what the issues Canada's students and recent graduates are facing and what Don't Forget Students is all about. I can be found online on Twitter at GT Sibley, and Don't Forget Students can be found online also on Twitter at Don't Forget Students. Students at the end there is spelled STDNS. It's pretty easy to find online through my Twitter account as well. Our petition is up on change.org, and it's probably easiest to find it through the link David's going to post, or just through our Twitter account. We're hoping to hit 1,000 signatures by the end of the day. We just launched yesterday. We really want to get some momentum behind us so students aren't forgotten, because I think you're 100% correct, David, that students really aren't getting enough help, for one, but we're being left behind even in the coverage of the scandal. So yeah, once again, thanks very much for having me on. Big fan of the channel, by the way. It's a privilege to come on.
Oh, no problem. Thank you. And I'll link to all that stuff below the video, including the social media link, so people check it out. Thanks again for coming on.
My pleasure, David. Take care.